I'm Jim Mintert. I'm the Assistant Director of Extension for Ag and Natural Resources at Purdue, and we're pleased to have you here this morning to discuss the implications of the drought of 2012, which unfortunately looks like it could be a drought of historic proportions. And so our goal here today is really twofold. We're going to start off the morning here giving you access to several of our key specialists and our county educators that are here this morning to discuss the conditions that exist in Indiana and also get some questions answered with respect to what could happen as the rest of the summer unfolds. And then later on today, we're going to have a meeting within Purdue Extension of our county educators and our specialists on campus to formulate some plans and develop some programs that we can offer to help alleviate and maybe help people in Indiana deal with the conditions arising from the drought, not only here this summer and fall, but looking at some of the longer run implications as well. So we're pleased you're here. I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm going to introduce Sarah Simpson from the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, and of course that's a strong partner of Purdue Extension, and Sarah is going to make a few brief comments on behalf of the Department of Agriculture. So Sarah?
Thank you, Jim. Good morning. My name is Sarah Simpson. I'm Director of Agricultural Policy with the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. And I am here today on behalf of our Director, Joe Kelsey. He sends his regrets. I know he was really looking forward to taking part in today's discussion. And I wanted to just share that as a farmer himself, our Director has a thorough understanding of how the current drought conditions could impact yields and revenues for farmers across our state, and also how it could impact and present difficulties with regard to future delivery contracts. Our department does not administer disaster programs. However, we do work collaboratively with the Farm Service Agency to prepare state disaster requests. So I am here today to offer our support in this very uncertain year and also to take concerns and action items discussed today back to Director Kelsey. So in closing, I want to express our appreciation to Purdue for bringing the ag and natural resources specialists and educators together today and other partners to discuss how we can work collectively regarding next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So our format this morning is going to be really twofold. During this press or media event, we're going to start off with two of our key specialists, Dr. Robert Nielson, Professor of Agronomy, and our Extension Corn Specialist. Dr. Nielson has been on the Purdue faculty since 1982, so he's had a lot of experience in the corn sector, obviously, over those 3 decades. And in particular, Bob's had the experience of dealing with several previous droughts in Indiana and can make some good comparisons there. So we're going to start off with Dr. Nielson. We will follow Dr. Nielson with Dr. Chris Hurt from Agricultural Economics. Dr. Hurt is a professor in ag econ and also the Extension Grain and Livestock Marketing Specialist. And again, Chris Hurt has been on the Purdue faculty, I think, since 1981. So again, a lot of experience there and over the years with various drought conditions and has a lot to offer as well. Following that, we will conclude the formal part of our media event. But then we will identify, we've got a large number of specialists from Purdue University here in various areas of agriculture that you can interview on a one-on-one basis. And we also have a number of our county extension ag and natural resource educators here that you could interview with respect to getting a better handle on local conditions in various parts of the state of Indiana. So at the conclusion of Dr. Hurt's remarks and after the question and answer session with those two specialists, I will identify those specialists that are here in the room and let you know what their individual specialty areas are to facilitate some interviews taking place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nielson for his remarks. So Bob, take it away.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts and concerns about this year's crop. It's certainly a situation that's as severe as it's probably been since the big drought of '88. And I think at this point in the season it would clearly be considered as bad as anything since '88. course, the rest of the season is yet to come. So, you know, as an agronomist, we're forever saying if it would only start raining tomorrow, this is what would happen. But at this point in time, it's certainly serious. Monday's report from USDA NASS indicated that crop condition ratings had continued to slide, and so the state's crop now is only about 19% good to excellent, which again is as low as it's been at this point in the season since 1988. 90% of the crop acres around the state are rated short to very short, and again, this is as severe as it's been since this point in 1988. And maybe importantly for the corn crop, as of Monday's USDA report, only 30% of the crop had reached the critical flowering or pollination stage, and that means about 3/4 of that crop is left to enter that period over the next week or so. And that period is extremely critical for a corn crop because it only has about, for an individual field, it only has about 7 days to finish this pollination process. And if it's interrupted or interfered with severe stress, that individual field can certainly suffer severe yield loss. And some of the data from years past would suggest that severe stress during that period can result in yield losses upwards of 10% yield loss per day. So you can imagine 4 or 5 days of truly severe loss at that time period. We're talking really serious loss on an individual field basis. You know, the challenge of talking about it on a statewide basis is the fact that, like any drought or any major weather issue, it varies around the state. The severity of it does. It varies even within a county. It varies within a field depending on soil types in a field. So it's really hard to talk about statewide impact with a lot of confidence. And so sometimes, again, as an agronomist, we can talk best about individual fields. This drought started very early, probably as early as any drought since 1988. And so there were fields around the state that were planted into soils that were already too dry for uniform germination and emergence. So we suffered yield loss in some fields around the state beginning as soon as germination and emergence. And many of those fields were too dry for farmers to replant into these thin stands, and so they're left with them now for the season. There's been some yield loss undoubtedly in fields during the vegetative time period leading up to pollination, because that's the time when these plants determine how large, what's the potential size of these ears, and that's going on during vegetative time period. And so, you know, if we lose that potential ear size going into pollination, well, that sets the limit right there for how much yield an individual field will have. And then, of course, the pollination period is important. And I have a little show and tell. I just can't resist as an extension specialist to have a little show and tell, because I'm not sure that everyone understands what the flowering process is in a corn plant. This crop, among all the major species that we grow for major row crops, is different in the fact that it's got its male and female flower parts separated in space. You know, we talk about the tasseling time, and these are 2 tassels from a corn plant. These are the male flowers of the corn plant, and of course they're at the top of the plant. So when we talk about the important tasseling period, these tassels are what we're talking about. You see these little, I'll say, doohickeys hanging off the tassels. Well, that's the technical term for anthers, and that's what contains the pollen. And so when you're out in the morning in a cornfield, and if you shake these tassels a little bit, and they've been in my cooler now, you won't see it, but you'll see the pollen grains, the pollen dust fall from it. And if you've grown sweet corn, you've seen this probably before. So these are the male flowers. And then the ears represent the female flowers. And we talk about silking, and so these are the corn silks. And again, if you've grown sweet corn, you've seen this before. But these silks are attached to the ovules of that female flower, and these silks need to receive pollen from the tassel in order to fertilize the ovules that these silks are connected to down at the cob in order for kernels to develop. This is the stage that most of our crop is in right now. Excessive heat and drought can reduce viability of pollen. It can reduce amount of pollen. It can cause pollen to shed earlier than it normally does. Whereas the ear side, the female side of this, these silks elongate from inside the husks and emerge eventually like you see here. And the elongation of these silks is often delayed in a severe drought. And so sometimes the silks emerge after the pollen is already gone. And this is the big concern I have around the state right now, is that we have so much of this crop entering this critical phase, and you can reduce yields so fast on an individual field basis that for an individual grower, I'm fairly certain there will be some disastrous, truly disastrous situations for individual growers. The big unknown or the big uncertainty is how will this translate to a statewide basis, and what percent of our total crops will encounter these kinds of conditions, and what will that mean on a statewide yield basis. Chris Hurt and I both play around with numbers, and I'm sure he'll share some of his estimates on yield losses too, and they may differ because it's an uncertain business. But if you look simply at crop condition ratings and historical yields over the years, and look at that historical relationship, and based solely on crop condition ratings throughout June and as of this Monday's report, based only on that, those historical relationships would suggest that we are already looking at a yield loss of maybe 13% below trend. And that, if that would come to pass, that would represent the 6th worst departure from trend since the drought of '83. And so we are in a realm that we haven't been in very often in the past 20 or 30 years. It is serious. It could get way more serious if this heat and drought don't break pretty soon. And that is, again, the big uncertainty. We don't know if it's going to break, but it certainly would appear that it's not going to break very soon based on what we hear from our meteorology colleagues. So, you know, it's serious now. It could get worse. It could stabilize. We just don't know. But, you know, this is one of these time will tell things, and we'll just keep monitoring it. And so with that, I think, Jim, that's maybe all the comments that I wanted to take on that. And I think I'll just turn it over to my colleague Chris Hurt from the Department of Ag Economics and let him share his comments with you. So, Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And those of you in the media, I think, got a blue sheet of paper that has a summary of some of the comments that I was going to make as we think about the economic side of this very grave concern that we are facing at this particular point. As Bob indicated, none of us really know the magnitude of the economic impact, the magnitude of the losses that we're going to see, but I think you know that this is going to be dynamic in the sense that as we go day by day, week by week, we're going to have more information. So certainly we'll stay on top of that. We'll provide you with some estimates that we have at this point. And again, we're not going to try to get these too specific simply because it is a dynamic and is going to be continuously changing. We do have from USDA enumerators that ask what the crop looks like. That information is in a what's called a crop progress report that comes out each Monday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we use that as about the best indicator we have across not only Indiana but the major corn and soybean production states as the best indicator at this point. It's not an accurate indicator of what the yields are, but as an example, in Indiana is the worst drought-related state of the major corn and soybean states. Indiana is the 5th largest corn and soybean state in the United States, and we have the worst of it. 50% of our crop is rated in the bottom 2 categories, very poor and poor. And when we get down to that very poor category, 19%, most of us consider that's virtually gone. So if you start thinking about on corn, 1 out of every 5 fields in Indiana, not saying it's gone, but it's in very grave, perilous condition. And we also remind, as Bob did, that data was as of last Sunday that report came in. We think there's further damage obviously occurring. Using those as a proxy to try to estimate some yields, I had corn yields down about 20% at this point, and that was, again, prior to the last 3 or 4 days, which have really been, I think, very devastating for this corn crop. We'd start out at about 166 bushels of yield for a normal crop. That put us down to about 133 bushels. If you take that, and again, remember, that's just a point in time. It's worse than that, I think, now, a few days later. That would be a loss in the state of about 195 million bushels of corn would not be produced this year. So again, we'd be up around 1 billion bushels to start out the year, that 20% loss representing about 200 million bushels. On soybeans, we'd start with a yield estimate around 49 for a normal crop. We have this one down around 41 bushels now at this, as of last Sunday's report, and that'd be about 37 million bushels of soybeans. Now, one of the things when we start to talk about economics, and you know, Bob brought his props to show you. I brought my props to show you as an economist, and that is, show me the money. Okay, so what does this mean when it comes to the money? That, again, is going to largely be determined coming up, so it's very hard to come up with really good estimates at this point. But one of the things we do know is that when yields are low in a major production state like Indiana, this tends to raise national prices of these crops. So as you think about that, producers are very interested as farmers in raising a lot of bushels, but what they're most interested in is the financial side, and that is the revenue that they generate. So as of Tuesday, prices of corn had gone up and prices of soybeans had gone up. So our estimates loss of 20% on yields, but prices actually had gone up about 25%. And I'm measuring that since the middle of May when we still had a full potential to raise a normal crop. So you can see that could be a fairly substantial help in terms of cushioning revenues for producers. On soybeans, we're estimating a yield drop at this point of 15%. Prices are up about 10%. So there, that certainly would not be a full compensation by any standpoint. But we'll really just have to see how this evolves, but I think that is an important point to keep in mind. A second point is that we think crop insurance will be a very important safety net for farmers around the state of Indiana. Estimates are that about 75% of the corn acreage in Indiana has some form of crop insurance, and about 65% of the soybean acres in the state of Indiana would have some form of crop insurance. Now, crop insurance is an election of individual farmers, so they will make a decision whether they want to have crop insurance or not. The second important point to note is that crop insurance is designed not to give full recovery from a financial loss. It's designed to avoid catastrophic loss. For a lot of producers, almost every year, they are betting all their financial well-being on that crop. So crop production costs are very high, record high levels. The risk that they face if they had a total loss are enormous. So crop insurance has been designed to try to help them from that catastrophic loss. But again, commonly they would buy coverage from about 65% coverage up to 85% coverage. Maybe something more on average, 70 to 75% coverage. So this still means they have a potential exposure of 25 to 30% exposure. So crop insurance really isn't like our home insurance, our car insurance, which many times is for replacement cost. That's just not the case in terms of crop insurance, but it's going to be very important, it looks like, in Indiana this year. Another point I think we want to make, as Bob had mentioned, this drought is now approaching the severity of the 1988 drought. Maybe 4 or 5 times a century we get one this bad. But we think the farm production sector and agriculture in general is in a much stronger financial position today than they were back in 1988. The reasons for that are that we've had 2 years of record farm incomes in Indiana. Previous to this, 2010 and 2011, It's always good to go into a downturn when you're coming from a very strong period of income. Of course, the second point is the net worth position of farmers. As a general statement, the net worth position of farmers is strong, and that is strong because we have record high land values in the state of Indiana at this particular point. Now, having said that, we want to always remind people those are general statements, and we will continue to see a lot of variation from farm to farm. Another thing I think that has been under considered is the impact on the animals sector in the state. We are certainly seeing the impacts of the drought very directly on the crop sector. It's not as obvious on the livestock sector, but some of our early estimates suggest the economic impacts may in fact be larger, and maybe quite a lot larger in terms of the animal sector of the state. The reason for that is that the animal sector are major users of corn and soybean meal for feed inputs. And so these very large increases we've seen so far for feed cost basically mean that animal producers have higher costs that they cannot pass on to consumers in the short run. That means they have to absorb essentially those losses out of their own financial situation. The second category after corn and soybeans, of course, are forage crops and haylage. This would relate very heavily to the dairy sector of our state as well as our beef sector of the state. What we're seeing is pastures that normally would be the forage supply for beef cattle and dairy cattle in the summertime in Indiana, where those pastures are essentially dried up and there's no more forage available. Those producers are having to feed hay supplies, perhaps that they produced earlier this spring. Unfortunately, those hay supplies, I guess the fortunate side is they're available now. The unfortunate side is that's the winter supply of forage that was going to be provided for those cattle, that now those producers will have to find some alternative, probably buying. And let me just conclude then by saying that the impact is going to be widely variable. We know certain parts of the state, particularly the southwestern part of the state, not only has been severely hit, but their corn crop in particular is just further along. It's, Bob, largely through pollination at this point. So non-pollination damage from lack of pollination is done. It's irreversible in terms of those kind of pollination losses that have already occurred. There are other major sectors that are going to be affected. We will certainly get to those over time, but you think about 200 million bushels less corn at this point, and that number could drop, and that is our grain handling and grain processing sector certainly will be dramatically affected, just simply not a lot of volume to handle this year. And that will obviously extend into farm machinery suppliers and many of the agricultural industries. But again, we're not going to start down that line from looking at those economic impacts simply because this is still unfolding. But we appreciate you being here and helping recognize that agriculture has a lot of support and that this is an unfolding, very big economic impact. Jim, let me turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And if I could ask you to just stay up here, I'm going to ask Dr. Nielson to join us, and then we'll open it up for questions for both Dr. Nielson and Dr. Hurt. And just one reminder to repeat the questions so that we are able to capture those on audio. So with that, let's open it up for questions.
Dr. Hurt, I'm wondering if you can go in more about the economic impact and the ripple effect of all of this.
Yeah, we certainly can, and of course we can come up with some estimates, but you know, when you have these 100-degree temperatures, the losses are occurring even at this minute. So whatever benchmark you set, that is different the next day. On the blue sheet, I do have those yield estimates on the back side. That's not economics, but some of the ripple effects that obviously we would expect to see. And I think clearly the animal sector is a ripple effect that we would see continuing. And another one that we're going to see is the food price impact. Now, Again, we don't know the final magnitude of these losses that are going to occur, but I think it's safe to say every American is going to feel some of this effect. We're not talking about huge increases in food prices because of this drought, but we are talking about measurable increases that will be noticeable, and it will be one of the things that will be talked about, I think, probably for the entire next year. We did talk about the impacts of the support sectors for agricultural production. Those support sectors are the input suppliers that provide inputs from machinery, fertilizer, debt capital, bankers, lenders, seed, and so forth. So those are definitely going to be impact. The processing sector is going to be impact. The handling and processing sector is going to also be impact. And then I think where we'd say the biggest impact is in our Indiana communities is in our rural communities. So in our rural communities, agriculture may actually be very important to the economic fiber and the economic well-being in those rural communities. So I think that's hard-hit rural communities certainly will feel that impact on their main streets as well. Next question.
Could you speak as far as what portion of food prices might be impacted?
Yeah, Corrine Alexander is here, and she'll work on that a little bit later if you want some individual interviews. But some of the first sectors that we would see affected would be things that are very directly related to grain prices. So wheat prices have gone up. So this would be things like bakery products, wheat, corn, soybeans, oats relate, not so much soybeans, but those other grains relate to cereal prices. So we would expect those to begin to reflect very quickly higher levels of price increases. Also, soybean oil is very important in terms of cooking oils, margarine, salad dressing. So those prices have already gone up substantially, and so we will quickly see those, even by late summer, begin to come into somewhat higher oil prices. Perhaps on the sugar side, sugar and sweeteners, high fructose corn syrup is a very important sweetener in our food products today. Those would expected to be coming up late summer and fall. Now, there are lags on the meat side, meat, dairy product side. The first thing that will happen is that the much higher feed prices are actually going to cause losses probably for the animal production sector, and depending on how bad our losses across the nation are, that will determine how much liquidation of breeding herds and flocks may have to occur. Some liquidation actually tends, on meats in particular, to drive increased supply of meat in the short run this fall. But what that means is the breeding herd to be producing offspring for 2013 food supply is greatly reduced. So again, we push up meat, dairy, and dairy product prices on into 2013. So those would be some of the directions. I think we also want to back up and be very cautious from a media standpoint of saying that, this is going to cause a huge percentage increase in food prices. That will not be the case. USDA is estimating 2.5% to 3.5% increase this year on food prices. And probably what we would say is that this drought, and again, we don't know the magnitude of where we will end with this drought, as we have more and more states to the west that are seeing their crops deteriorate as well. But that will probably push that up to the high end of that, more to the 3.5% range. Now, obviously, the difficulty is that is one of the necessities of life and our family budget. Food, now with prices probably pushing up more than incomes are going to go up. So this has this negative impact on the family budget. when food prices are going up by a higher percentage than family incomes are rising. Next question. Rich.
You know, a lot of people sitting in their house, hey, it rained, my flowers are good, my
Bob.
grass is turning green again. I mean, is this a rainstorm or two away from being over, or for the people whose view of agriculture extends to the curve, how deep are we in this and how long is this going to be going?
Okay, the question, I'm going to let Bob respond here. The question is, how far are we, and could this change, and would it make any difference if the weather changed right now?
And I wish I had a definitive answer for you. You know, these droughts are devilish things, and it's really hard to predict you know, what it takes to break them. And of course, from a crops perspective, it depends on where those crops are in their stage of development. So we can say that every day, every week that goes by without a break in the heat or the drought, the crop condition simply deteriorates, and will continue to do so. And as Chris indicated earlier, much of this yield loss we've sustained already is irreversible, and so we're already limited on the top end. You know, what it would take to break a drought, you know, I would say maybe somewhere 4, 5, 6 inches over several weeks' time would certainly go a long ways towards breaking the effects. You know, the storms that rumbled through the state over the weekend, depending on where you were, some folks had, you know, 1 to 2 inches of rain out of it. Others only had a ½ inch. Even on the short side, the areas that only received a quarter or ½ an inch, it was remarkable over the next 24 to 48 hours how the crops responded. And there was a bit of a breather for the crops, if you will, a bit of an opportunity to maybe get through the pollination process from the corn's perspective. And so, you know, when you're in a major drought like this, any rain helps. I mean, that's one way to look at it. But you need to, if you're only going to get small amounts of rain, then you clearly need to sustain that on a timely basis and continue to get small amounts of rain in order to keep it going. If I remember '88 correctly, the drought began to lessen, maybe not break, but it began to lessen somewhere in late July. And that allowed the soybean crop in particular to recover during the month of August and avoid serious losses. We still had serious losses in the corn crop, but it could have been worse. And that's the uncertainty right now is, I never thought we'd see yields drop off as much as those droughts of '83 or '88, but if this doesn't let up, and if it truly remains dry through August, I'm afraid we could see losses more serious than those great droughts of the '80s. And but again, it's this every day at a time kind of thing. So
could you talk about why beans are different than corn with
right.
regard to a weather change?
Right.
Sometime here in
well, you know, earlier I indicated that for an individual cornfield, it has maybe 7 days to complete the pollination process and to set that grain. Soybean crop, and my colleague Sean Castile is here, who's our soybean specialist. You can visit with him afterwards on specific interviews. But the soybean crop has a much longer flowering period, and so it's also struggling at this point in time. It's aborting flowers, much like the corn plant is, but it has several more weeks yet to recover. So if this drought would break or lessen, say, in another week or two, the soybean crop could continue to flower and could continue to set seed. And so a little more cushion on the soybean crop, but I would dare say that if it continues through August, that soybean crop is in a big world of hurt also, because there's just a limit to how long that crop will continue to flower also.
Bob, the fact that this came earlier than '88, is that one of the reasons that we're likely to see much more devastation than we did in '88?
The question was, and correct me if I am wrong, but you said that because this drought started earlier than '88, would it help me out?
Yeah, would that mean that the losses this year are going to be more severe, likely to be more
Yeah, would it mean the losses this year would be more severe or not? Actually, '88 started earlier. By the time of planting in '88, it was already much drier than it was this year, and we had even more fields that didn't emerge well in '88. And this year was probably second earliest to 88. One of the good things about an early drought, if there is such a thing, is that it tends to allow the crops to root a little more deeply early in the season. Usually in Indiana, our soils are too wet and too cold to encourage deep rooting. So I think up until these last few weeks, as the heat has really set on, I think what has helped both crops, but maybe especially corn, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say especially corn. I think it helped both crops that they're rooted a little more deeply this year, and they've been tapping into the subsoil moisture better this year than they typically do, and that has helped sustain some of these fields from developing severe drought stress symptoms earlier than they have. But of course, these subsoil moisture levels, there's only so much of it, and the depth of that subsoil rooting profile varies around the state, and some fields simply don't have as deep of a rooting profile, therefore not as much soil to explore to get moisture out of. So I think in many places around the state we're simply running out of soil moisture, period, and that's why in these areas the stress will continue to escalate in the coming weeks. And I can't, I guess, emphasize enough the importance of this truly excessive heat. You know, the heat by itself, if we had adequate soil moisture, these days in the 90s or even the high 90s, yeah, they wouldn't be desirable, but they wouldn't be as detrimental. But when you combine that excessive heat with truly soil moisture deficit soils, that's the killer combination, and that's what's really has driven the decrease in these crop condition ratings in the last couple of weeks, is that return of this excessive heat that began a week or so ago. And there's no let up. Well, I guess there's a let up maybe coming early next week down into the 80s. But the point is, we've got these next few days of these truly excessive heat levels, which are obviously hard on humans, but my gosh, it's really driving this drought stress on all the crops out there. Next question.
One more question,
Tom.
Your standpoint, Chris, you know, we've got the ethanol industry. If we end up 200 million bushels short, what's that going to, what effect the ethanol industry doing there? They still get their bushels? Do our prices higher here, or do it affect it?
The question is, if we have these major losses in Indiana, we're talking about 200 million as of last Sunday, and I don't know what that would be today, but it would be bigger losses. Will end users be able to secure supplies? Of course, we really have to look at that on a national basis, and I do have some of those estimates, at least on national yields, on the back side of that blue sheet for the media that got that. On a national basis, the yield losses, of course, are not as big because we're the worst of the states, but still they're very large by our estimates. 1.5 billion bushels nationally of yield loss would bring the national crop down. If you start with USDA's 14.8 billion bushels of corn, brings that down to about 13.2 to 13.3 billion bushels of corn. The specific question was about the ethanol industry. And we have the policy of the United States, the law of the United States is that the ethanol industry, and let me back up one step to say it's not the ethanol industry, the blenders of gasoline must buy a fixed amount of ethanol. That ethanol is produced primarily with corn. So the law of the land says that basically the ethanol industry will get the first 5 billion bushels of corn that is produced. And that if there's only 10 billion bushels and we need 13 billion, then everybody else that uses has to fight over that. So we've already had some discussions with people in Washington already this week. Is there any possibility that if this becomes more of a national situation, which it certainly is evolving in that direction, as we saw Illinois really begin to deteriorate sharply last week and other states further to the west. This would have to be a change of the law. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions now, and the issue again that you haven't heard too much since 2008 is going to come back, food versus fuel. So we're going to hear that discussion come back again. We're going to see that discussion not just in the United States, but I think around the world. as high food prices are not desirable for U.S. consumers, but for world consumers, several billion of which are trying to live on $2 a day. It is a tremendous tragedy in terms of pushing higher food prices, pushing people around the world into greater poverty. So it probably is going to be an issue. So I think all end users are going to be fighting, and some of that is going to be a political battle that's going to be waged, I believe, it looks like, in Washington as well.
We're going to conclude the formal part of the conference and allow the media to visit individually with specialists, county educators, and other members of Indiana agriculture. So with that, thank you very much for coming.